Yeah. All right. I was explaining who we are, and I'm going to start again. Liberation Alliance Africa. We're a collective of African feminists on the continent and diaspora working to disrupt the legacies of historical colonial inequalities and domination and its resulting using African feminist scholarship. We recognize in our space that we cannot continue to live with the memories of others as ours, and that our future will not be birthed in a vacuum. So we started Liberation Alliance Africa because we want to explore new frontiers. We want to reimagine our individual and collective futures, and we want to sustain an alliance of conscious Africans, raising our voices in resistance and celebration to disrupt existing power structures that undermine feminist liberation, challenge structures of oppression and raise consciousness towards collective liberation. We channel our energies and dreams through radical knowledge production, policy advocacy, decolonial feminist organizing, and the documentation of the cultural evolution of liberation in Africa. The conversation we are having today is the fourth part of a 5-part series that we started in April titled Disrupting Colonial Legacies in Africa. So far, we are focused on diverse topics and we have interrogated topics around leadership, climate justice, and economic justice. We would share the links if you want to catch up on the previous episodes. We've uploaded them on YouTube, and you can also follow us on social media to get more updates. Today, we will be focusing our conversation on philanthropy. And I am so honored to be moderating this session. And I also have with me radical feminist speakers who are doing amazing work within the philanthropic space. I have Gloria Mugabe-Kazi, I have Nadia Haijo, and I have Ese Emrahi. They will lead the conversation and usher us into a space to rethink and interrogate Africa's philanthropic landscape, and also deepen insights on emerging frontiers on philanthropy that is truly decolonial and liberatory. I will introduce the speakers one by one, and I know that once they start speaking, you will also get to know more about them. Gloria is an African feminist and development strategist whose work is premised on challenging systemic injustice to marginalized people in Africa. She works at the intersection of philanthropy, feminist funding, gender, and reproductive justice. Her work is deeply rooted in the reimagination of a new world using decolonial approaches. She currently works at UHAI, ESHRI, a Pan-African indigenous and activist-led funding across 7 countries in East Africa. Gloria loves writing, and her work has been published in national media outlets and feminist digital platforms. And she is also the 2023-2024 Shape the Power Fellow, a mobilizing force that seeks to highlight, harness, resource, legitimize, and join up these new ways of deciding and doing that are emerging around the world under the larger umbrella of movement generosity, so that it can galvanize a vision of a good society and serve as a force for genuine and lasting change. Nadia is a Pan-African feminist. Gloria, do you want to say hi? Let people see you briefly before I move to Nadia.
Thank you, Toby. That was very powerful. I'm like, who is that being introduced? But yeah, everybody, this is Gloria Mugabe-Kazi, also known as Mugasha as well. I'm really happy to be here. Back to you, Toby.
Thanks, Gloria. Nadia is a Pan-African feminist development professional whose work leverages partnerships and philanthropy to resource African feminist and women's rights movements. In her free time, Nadia loves writing feminist reflections, short story fiction, and children's stories available on nadiahaijo.com. She's the current Director of Partnerships and Philanthropy at the African Women's Development Fund, AWDF. AWDF aims to fund, strengthen, and uphold the organizations and movements led by African feminists, women, girls, and gender-expansive persons in pursuit of gender justice and social transformation. Hi, Nadia. Do you want to say hi?
Sure. Hello. As you were reading that, I was also like Gloria. I was like, that sounds a little too fancy, but it is me. So nice to see everyone here and excited for the conversation.
Nice to have you, Nadia. And I'm interested to reading your stories on your website, so I'll be looking out for that. Essay is another speaker that we have here. Essay is the global network weaver for the Global Fund for Community Foundations. In her role, she works with and helps to strengthen connections across GFCF's global network of community philanthropy and civil society partners. She also works with allies in the Shift the Power movement around shaping broader advocacy, influencing and engagement efforts involving other parts of the mainstream and development sector. SS sits on the advisory board of the Cambridge Global Challenges, University of Cambridge, representing a Global South voice on important global issues, especially around the Shift the Power movement. Hi, SA.
Hi, everyone. Really honored to be here.
We are so happy to have you here, SA. Thank you so much. Right now, I have introduced our speakers, and I can see we are also introducing ourselves in the chat box. So let's keep that moving. Tell us where you are in the world, where you're joining us from, and your name. We'd like to know you, and let's also keep the conversation going in the chat. So to start the conversation, I would like to usher us into a space of reflection. And in doing that, I would like to read from the liturgy In a Time Not So Far Away by NAWI. NAWI is an Afri-Fem macroeconomics collective. And I'm reading this to bring all of us into the room while, we prepare for the conversation. The world has become much more complicated in the years since. It is larger, more connected in consequence, more disconnected in practice.
But yeah, they've already.
How do you make change
when
when decisions are not your own? Please let us join and mute.
The content of the information itself, because they put out and they published information.
I'm not sure who this person is, but I have muted everyone. So I have muted everyone, and I do apologize for that. I have to mute everyone all at once so that we don't have all of these interruptions. If you do need to speak, please raise your hand and I would unmute you. And Omolara is also here to manage logistics. Right, I'm going to start again. The world has become much more complicated in the years since. It is larger, more connected in consequence, more disconnected in practice. How do you make change when decisions are not your own? When you can't discuss under the oldest tree in the land, when relationships aren't between the land and the people you know, but between systems and actors far removed from you, when scarcity has taken the place of abundance, when you can discuss under the oldest tree in the land, when relationships aren't between the land and the people you know, but between systems and actors far removed from you, when scarcity has taken the place of abundance and extraction has taken the place of the intimacy of the connectedness of the living world. In this place, how do they make change? They start with the desire that leads to demands. In a time not so far away, a time perhaps parallel to the one we are now, a new way is coming into being. The next time you blink, stay there. Keep your eyes closed for just a few more seconds, and you will see it, the future, coming into being, the future, now. Diving into the conversation, I invite Essay, Nadia, and Gloria to share with us the key representations of colonial legacies in philanthropy. How do they shape the development landscape? Let us reflect back on, the key representations. What are they really? when it comes to the philanthropic landscape. Can we identify colonial legacies, and what are they, and how do they shape the development landscape? Any one of the speakers can go first.
Thank you, Toby. I think, I mean, there are a few things, right? One of the things, and that was, I heard it strongly as you were reading as well, is how we think about accountability and how we embody it. I find that a colonial legacy we have is that we don't necessarily, at least in philanthropy, think about accountability to our movements. We think about accountability to whoever is paying, is giving the money. And we even think about philanthropy as being just about money. Instead of being that whole ethos of how you resource social transformation and social justice. It shows up in how we talk, how we listen, and how we engage, which show up in very extractive and capitalist ways. It shows up in how we define and we determine our priorities. We follow the bandwagon of whatever is sexy at that time, right? Now it seems to be, is it women's rights? I don't know, but anyway. And it shows up in how we think about how we tell our stories, because increasingly we are asking people to tell stories, and we are telling stories to fundraise, right, or to talk about impact. But surely we should be uplifting our knowledge, our narratives, our voices, without having to prove that we've done something amazing so that somebody somewhere will give us money. And I think lastly, it shows up in how we understand relationships, in partnership, in movements, and also how we think about how power and privilege and bias show up in those relationships and how we nurture them. Yeah, I'll
Thank you so much, Nadia. I don't know if Essay or Gloria would like to add to that.
Yeah, I can jump in. Oh, sorry, Gloria, but you're going to go first? Okay. I think maybe just sort of putting some context to this, the development humanitarian sector, this is an almost 80-year-old agenda that was never meant to really empower those in the global south. And in the last few years, there's been a strong recognition that its time has come to die or to change. But we must also remember that, this system, as I mentioned, was really never meant to empower. It was a system of control. It was a system based on money. It was a system based on power. It was a system based on greed. And if given aid in the humanitarian or philanthropy sector was about solving problems and correcting injustice, my main question is then, why do we still have so many toxic problems today? We haven't solved those problems. What we've done in this sector is just to push the ball just a little bit further down the field so we can justify our strategic plans for the next 3, 5, 7 years. We don't really try to solve those problems, right? And the aid system has been about attending to someone else's imagined needs. And this is how harm has been caused to those, especially in the global south. Now, if we're thinking about, colonialism specifically and its impact, this was sort of I'll use the light word project. This was a project that took place between the 1800s and 1960s. And the impact has, Nadia has mentioned, has sort of embedded its way into how we even think and how we problem solve and how we see ourselves, right? The later half of the 20th century, many critical thinkers from the global south mostly have been involved in many critiques about challenging the direct and indirect manifestations of colonial domination. For Africans, I think the agenda for decolonization and decolonial activism, it needs to focus on a few things for us to really embrace who we are and to move forward boldly. So one of those things, some of those things are really reclaiming our humanity, rebuilding our territorial and bodily integrity, restoring our own spirituality, dismantling the material and symbolic foundations of the colonial capitalist state. It also involves reparations of historical wrongdoings. It involves decentering Western knowledge and cultures regarding race, gender, sexuality, and I will even go as far as language. So we are fortunate to be having this conversation in English. That's great, but that is not our language in Africa. So even just things like speaking the way that we know our own languages is also a way of reclaiming space, reclaiming our time. And I think, there is the Ubuntu philosophy, the worldview that, you are because I am, that interconnectedness of all the things within us, right? I think the humanitarian aid agencies now, their narrative around decolonization is not a call to end the sector, because they are the ones that have power, they're the ones that have money. But for them, they see in this conversation as a way of course correcting their own work and softening some of the power imbalances. There is the question about legitimacy. Should they still remain NGOs, donors from the global north? Should they still remain in this discourse? And if they do, what role should they play? And all of this is really around the sort of underbelly, underlining foundation of power. Who has power? Is it power with? Is it power over? And how do power isn't something that is easily given away from history. You have to kind of grab it, right? And take it. So I think when it comes to philanthropy specifically and philanthropy in Africa, we have to recognize that this philanthropy is operating within this colonial structure. And there are legacies remaining around it, given the inherent power imbalance between the funders and, I don't like to use this word, beneficiaries or grantees, I guess. Decolonized philanthropy has to really focus on breaking some of these reinforced cycles of hierarchical oppression. I want to talk a little bit about power and money now. I think there was a report that was released just last year, towards the end of last year, by Oxfam. This report is Inequality Kills, and it talked about just the wealth of the world's 10 richest men doubled just since the pandemic, the COVID pandemic began. Economic violence to them is something that is perpetrated when structural policy choices are made for the richest and most powerful. It has, I think in looking at the numbers, every 4 seconds, somebody in the global south dies because of actions and policies and decisions made by those with power from the global north. In 2018, just 2 years before the pandemic, there were 12 white men that owned 80% of the world's wealth. 2 years past the pandemic, there have now been thousands, several billionaires directly because of the pandemic. And so when we're thinking about funding flows from the global north to the global south, what we're really scrambling for is less than 1% of the funding that comes to the global south. Of the billions estimated, over 99% stays within the ecosystem, the structure of NGOs, home office, the INGOs will have their home, their headquarters space somewhere in the global north, but then they will also have an office based in Nigeria or based in South Africa or based in Kenya. And that crowds out many of the local organizations. So for me, yes, decolonization is about structuring or restructuring the funding flows, but it's also about us claiming our own agency and taking back, I guess, our time, taking back our space. I can talk a little bit more about the Shift the Power global movement and what this looks like on the ground, but I'll pause here and give the mic to Gloria.
Thank you so much, Essie. It's interesting to hear you, weave the interconnectedness of economic justice and philanthropy, because truly these issues are all interconnected. When we look at the economic policies that we have and how it has, been so extractive, we look at how even in the philanthropic space, we also find that extractivism in the philanthropic space, and how we cannot, truly fight for a decolonial philanthropy without also examining the current economic injustice and also the colonial legacies within that space. I will call Gloria now to also share a submission on the issue.
Thank you so much, Toby. Thanks, Essie and Nadia, for starting us off very well. And just to add on to Essie's points around how philanthropy in and of itself is deeply steeped in these colonial relics and residuals that we have inherited in the ways in which we are working, right? So like even the understanding of development or aid work or philanthropy stems from the fact that there is this developed world, quote unquote, that is trying to save the underdeveloped world or the developing world or the global south, depending on whatever language has been, constantly modified. And I think it's important for us to be very alive to that factor that philanthropy exists within these structures. And what that means is it also reinforces these structures, like Essie was saying. We see that in the ways in which we design our programs or our solutions to be global north facing, or whoever is funding us, because we want to have that sort of legitimacy and credibility that we have believed we don't have as a people, because our identity and our knowledge has been constantly and historically stripped away. So we are constantly trying to navigate this world that we believe is not equal, obviously, because of like even this conversation that we are having. But while we're doing that, we're also trying to, I guess, play to the oppressors' music. We're trying to work around the oppressors' gaze. And we've seen like, we implement projects and policies and programs that are very detached from our reality, and programs that are continuously exported to us. I was just thinking about reflecting on how most of us have, like a policy around diversity and inclusion. But when you look at that, it has been imported from the West and the global North, because obviously their cultures and their systems have been built on historical exclusion of people and indigenous people and people with disabilities, queer people. And so they've had to have that sort of languaging and documentation that can legitimize their inclusion or their work that is geared to freedom and liberation. And so we continuously import such policies, such things, such language that are detached from our reality and our context. And rightly so, because we've been over time told that our context doesn't matter, it's invalid or it's inferior, we don't have the solutions. And so even as we come into this conversation, it's important that we peg philanthropy in that space, because that's how philanthropy has been done. Obviously, like the mainstream philanthropy, this is without the African ways of doing philanthropy. I also wanted to reflect on why philanthropy or development work also exists, which is because of the existing gaps and limited access to healthcare, to education, to basic services and needs of people that have been states and governments have overlooked intentionally, or they aren't prioritizing. And so philanthropy and development or aid come into that space to sort of give solutions that are based off of the symptoms. And so even as we are practicing philanthropy, we need to be able to look at the root cause of the problems that we're solving, be it poverty, be it, in social injustices or economic inequality, or human rights violations, it's important that we acknowledge that there has been a lack of accountability and prioritization from people that should be prioritizing citizens, and instead of utilizing citizens and taxpayers' resources to build and construct infrastructure that is geared to uplifting people's lives and really just providing a comfortable life, like access to healthcare, which is a very basic thing, where we're finding ourselves having to, look to outside countries and donors and aids for them to be able to support us with this kind of work. And so even as we're doing philanthropy or development, it's important that we question that, like, why are we in this space? Why are we asking the Global North or whichever private foundation is able to contribute to basic things that we are entitled to, like healthcare, right? And when we talk of colonial legacies, like I was reflecting earlier, they show up constantly in the ways in which we write our programs, we even think about our solutions, that they have to fit a certain narrative that is acceptable or that has been legitimized off of the language that is within the development world. As a grant maker, I often have conversations with some of our partners or grantees, and it's usually, I don't know how to write this proposal. I don't know if it's going to be acceptable. I need the language. I need to fit into whatever, like whatever templates the donor has. And my advice, or like my reflection with them is always about, this work, you live this everyday life, this is your lifestyle, this is you waking up to go and find food for your family, so you understand that context. And it's important that we keep hearing certain such reaffirmations from people in this world, that people in this sector around philanthropy, that the people that we are funding or we're working with have the solutions. And just to also add on to the point around wealth and how philanthropy is also deeply steeped in this idea that there's the wealthy people that are giving to the less wealthy or the vulnerable people. It's important that we unpack that wealth, as we know that wealth accumulation or generation is usually built off of the back of the most vulnerable people. And these are usually exploitative ways in terms of underpaid labor or unpaid labor, which are also steeply rooted in colonial and slavery histories of, Black bodies and Indigenous bodies working on plantations without enough pay or even care or even remuneration that relates to the kind of labor that they're inputting. And so there has been people that have accumulated that mass amounts of wealth. And now we're in this era where it's almost, obviously it's a good thing to give back. It's a good thing to give to people that don't have. But I think we should move a little bit out of the giving, but question why there has to be certain people that are having billions and billions of dollars of money, and there are people that don't have a meal for the night. And so the fact that philanthropy comes within that space of wealth accumulation, without necessarily questioning how wealth is generated and accumulated, it is something that we definitely need to look into. And also the issue around trust and how, philanthropy and development is still practiced in this ecosystem where there is a certain group of people that can be trusted with resources because they understand how to work with money, or they have systems and structures and policies in place that quote unquote can ensure accountability. And so it comes into that space already, not trusting the people that are doing the work, that are finding their own solutions, that again do not have that I don't want to say capacity, but do not have that level of perhaps infrastructure within their internal organizations that the funders or partners that are looking for. And so people already coming into these spaces with low trust of, that's why even, most of the reporting mechanisms are usually violent and traumatic in the ways in which some of the partners ask for accountability. And I think for a very long time, we saw how most of us and people who have been doing this work, we've had to do reporting that was almost very violating and very traumatizing. You've had to take pictures of people that are going through a traumatic experience because you want to account to the funder or to the donor that you indeed did this work. And so, yeah, we have a lot of colonial legacies within philanthropy that we need to undo. And I can stop here, and I think I'll be able to share more as the conversation goes.
I
Thank you
think I
so
want
much.
to.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I just want to pick up, I think, on something that Gloria and both Gloria and Essay have been saying, is that it has warped the way we think about what philanthropy is, right? Because we are stuck in thinking about philanthropy as charity and aid through donors, through corporate social responsibility. In every single African country culture that you have, there are tontines. In French, they call them tontines. In West Africa, they call them susus. These collaboratives with our mothers, our aunties, who they save communally when there are weddings, funerals, anything that the community goes through, they are there to resource. So I think we're stuck in thinking about philanthropy in a specific way. Meanwhile, our African and in many ways our feminist practices of being in community with each other are separate, right? And so we are stuck in this thing of thinking about philanthropy as this thing versus this thing. And I think that limits us a lot. The language that we use limits us a lot because we are stuck in this language of writing proposals, telling impact stories, we are reducing human experience and livelihoods to numbers of beneficiaries and impact stories, and all because we are adopting that language of development and philanthropy to do the tap dance that we need to do to get the resources. So I think even before we even get into the idea of, how are you fitting people's diverse lives into an issue, right? It's about even the language that we use and how our feminist and our African values of Ubuntu show up in how we think about communities, how we are accountable to each other, and how we resource each other, not just with money, because that again is it's very colonial, it's very capitalist, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. And I do agree with you and what Gloria and also Essay has shared. You, Nadia, also, when you started off the conversation and when you were talking about, we also need to examine how we tell our stories, how we share about our lives, and then bringing it to how, Essay, went deeper into talking about power and control. And now we also need to interrogate privilege and who holds power and how philanthropy is about, when we talk about philanthropy in this space, we always think about money, and money is political. And Gloria, just took us to another reflective mood of looking at even the basic things as report writing, which is always often violent and oppressive. And sometimes we don't see it that way because we just feel this is what we've always known, this is how it should be done, but we don't interrogate all of these donor-grantee relationship practices even further because, I don't know, we don't know any different, or we don't have the luxury to dream of alternatives. But I would like us to reflect further on how do we think, or in what ways do we think this deprivation of agency, of autonomy, of us as African people, as even with people in the development space, how has this deprivation of autonomy and agency, how has it affected the idea and practice of philanthropy in Africa?
Maybe I can jump in here,
Yes,
Toby. I think all of this conversation, I saw a comment on in the chat that this is a timely conversation to be talking about African philanthropy or philanthropy in Africa. And there's a political distinction between those two in terms of how you phrase it. So of all of the negative things that COVID-19 did to the world, one of the positive things that came out of that was that people actually had a moment to pause. And in that pause, reflect on all of the toxic and horrible behaviors that they have engaged in. So people refusing to go back to work, just saying, that was not really what I wanted to do, or focusing on mental health issues, for instance. I think it gave that break for us to now begin to have these reflective conversations about our own role in how we see or what we describe as a good society, right? So this year alone, in the different spaces that I've been in across the continent, African philanthropy has spent a lot of time asking itself very difficult questions. So from Senegal to Kenya, from South Africa to Ghana, Nigeria, these questions keep coming up in terms of like, how do we shape our own narrative on power? How do we advocate for a broader enabling environment that not only strengthens institutional giving, but also everyday giving of people, of Black people on the continent? How do we sustain the momentum that African philanthropy has spent the last decade trying to prove itself to a Western gaze, as Gloria mentioned? I think in the probably 10, 15, I would say moving as far back as maybe 20 years ago, the conversation about philanthropy in Africa was only about what the global North could give to Africa. We didn't have any assets, we didn't have agency, we didn't have voice. And when African development practitioners showed up to these conferences in the global North, it was only about what was going to be given to them, not about what they were bringing to the table. And so if we spent the last decade plus really trying to reassert ourselves, now I guess is the moment of really trying to sustain that momentum and to actually show that we do give. And I think one of the criticisms of philanthropy in Africa, and not necessarily African philanthropy in Africa, is that because it is so diverse, because it is everyday giving, because I'm giving to my neighbor to pay for medical school fees or to my family member for school fees or whatever sort of emergency that comes up, that is not tracked, that isn't reported to any agency. And because it is not tracked, it is not seen, and therefore it is not relevant, right? So in the US, they can immediately pull up the data that this number of people gave X amount in a particular year. That number probably is double that in Africa because we just don't count it. The only giving that is counted is money coming in from the diaspora, which is significant, and in some cases even equal to the GDP of a particular nation. But it is not the only way that we give. And so I think one of the maybe resolutions or recommendations is how do we on the continent begin to count that data, that given, not because we want to prove something, but because this is just how we give. This is just how we are. And I think one realization is that the horizontal everyday giving, that was never colonized by the West. It has always been ours. And I think in a webinar I was in yesterday, someone mentioned that, this idea of community giving or African giving or local giving, it is ancestral. It's always been with us. It's the fabric of being an African. As an African, as the eldest daughter in my family, I have some specific responsibilities that I must give, whether or not I like it. That's just the role. That's just what it is. And so I think, that idea that this thing that was never colonized, if we are now deciding that we want to decolonize philanthropy, we have to be careful not to apply a broad brush across the board, because it would then displace this communal giving that is really, really important. And I think it was Nadia or Gloria that mentioned this, decolonization is not just about money, but it's also about the relationships South-South, right? So we have this tendency to paint a romantic picture about communities in the global south. We are all one, we all speak the same thing. The same community that supports women's rights will not support gay rights. The same community that would advocate for malnutrition for children may not advocate for another particular rights around housing or healthcare or whatever issues. So I think we also need to be careful not to romanticize too much some of our communities, some of the healing that needs to happen, some of the unlearning is for us to actually now begin to see ourselves and to actually sort of count the differences, yes, but agree to disagree, I guess, if we need to be. It's not all the same picture. I don't sing the same song that is necessarily in Kenya or elsewhere, but we can agree that we're all Africans and we are in this space together. So those are just sort of my 2 points in terms on your question there.
Thank you so much, Essie. And I do agree with you that we don't even have the luxury to romanticize our oneness or our togetherness. We do agree, that we come from a shared historical colonial relationship or experience, but we also need to recognize our differences in addressing issues. We also need to recognize our contribution to the state of things currently. I don't know if Nadia Gloria would like to jump in on it.
I could jump in. I think Essie really did speak so much about like how the way philanthropy is practiced and positioned right now, it deprives us of our own identities and practices that we have known for years to be working. I think Nadia earlier talked about how, our parents, our mothers were part of these circles that would, collect funds and take their kids to school, take care of the sick people. And although, of course, we can acknowledge that is also at the back of a lack of an infrastructure that should be supporting all of that. But I'm just thinking about how also what AC talked about around being lumped into the global south. It has been a language that I think I have, and so many of us as feminists and activists and critics have been wary of, because indeed all it does is it imagines that the global south is this homogeneous community that is moving in one line in kumbaya, singing and dancing to the same tune, which is very skewed, of course, because what happens in East Africa is completely different from what happens in West Africa and completely different from what happens in Asia, in Brazil, and all these other countries and places that are lumped within the global south. I also think that one of the things that, like these neo-colonial practices that are embedded in philanthropy that have done is take away our imagination and our creative ways or thinking around how we can solutionize, because again, we are constantly thinking of what is credible, what is legitimate, or what will pass within these frameworks that have been set for us. So I feel, this is not even just a feeling. Most of our solutions have also continuously to be detached from our reality, because again, we want to appeal to that gaze. I think about things like insurance, for example, that are heavily colonial and very capitalistic and very extractive and extortive, instead of us, thinking communally of the ways that have worked for us for a very long time, and maybe perhaps finding ways of molding them and shifting them to the current context of our modernization to our level. We are constantly looking to the solutions that have been already crafted, and we are inheriting them. When we're thinking about, things like investment or excuse me, or creating other forms of income, again, we're thinking outside of our community, outside of our people, when there is a community that we exist in and we come from that already has some of these maybe practices or programs around saving, around investment, but we're continuously thinking outside of ourselves. And also what that does is that over the time, as a colonized people, we're going to just keep regurgitating the colonizers' solutions, the colonizers' language. I think Essie mentioned about like this conversation being in English, but it is just the reality that we have constantly looked outside of ourselves instead of, for example, finding a language that could unite us. You know, Swahili is spoken in over, I think, 5 countries now that could potentially unite a certain part of a continent, but we're continuously, constantly saying that we cannot go that route because, you know, how are we going to communicate? It will take us forever to find commonalities in terms of language and all these countries coming together around the same language. And so, yes, for sure, it has taken away a part of us. We're continuously depending on, you know, the global north or what's going on or what is current and trending, and continuously invisibilizing what we already are doing that is contextual. I think about climate change, for example, and how it's framed around this narrative that the entire world is burning, and all of us should wake up right now and contribute to these to the solutions. But when you think about it, Africa and indigenous communities are one of the least communities and contributors to the climate change crisis. But when the global north is designing programs or you know, priorities, setting priorities, it is one blanket and one size fits all. And so we all have to now think about how to contribute to combating, you know, carbon emissions, even when most of our people don't even travel by air or even by road. And also maybe some of the ways in which people and African and indigenous communities contribute still to a very minimal level to crises like climate change is because they also don't have access to food, access to education. And so maybe they will cut a certain piece of land and cultivate it so that the child can go to school. And so lacking that intersectionality within our issues and within our approaches, I do feel like that is the work of you know, colonial legacies that we're existing in right now, which constantly strips us of our autonomy, our independence, our imagination, and the power to create a new world that we're all working towards. Yeah.
I think, I mean, for me, this brings us back to that question of like, you know, knowledge and narratives, right? And Esther, you raised this. So I think this question of data and numbers, like it always comes into the conversation with a very like white supremacist frame, right? Is that you have to count so that you can prove. But actually, African cultures and practices, as diverse as they are, have always nurtured and centered storytelling, whether it's oral storytelling, whether it's other forms of storytelling. So how are we leveraging this to tell our own stories, to tell our narratives around what philanthropy means to us, right? And detaching it ourselves from that language of programs and, you know, and outcomes and impact, right? And I think it's very important because increasingly there has been a lot of research that has been done and documentation that has been done around, you know, what we're calling African giving, African philanthropy, how that shows up using a feminist lens, etc. But it's in English, right? And even like coming back to this webinar, it's also using terms that you have to have studied in English, you have to have studied extensively. If I'm 16 and I'm sitting in this particular webinar that we're in right now, I would struggle, right, to understand what we're talking about. But in my daily life, I see manifestations of philanthropy as it is practiced with, you know, the Africanness of it, and not to bring everybody together as one unit or to romanticize it, but the daily practices of community giving and of accountability to each other and to our movements, and in how we live in relationship and in community with each other, and influence our societies removed from that white gaze, right, and those white priorities, often shows up in how we talk about it. We're often in echo chambers with each other, you know, talking to each other in the languages that we all understand, with using the terminology that, and the development sector and the philanthropic sector is so good at this, right? If you don't say these words, if you don't use them, you are never going to go to the events, speak on the panels, because you're not using that language, you know? And so I think that is also a very colonial practice and a very colonial lens of limiting access to people, you know, and stripping people of their agency and their power, right? Because if they can't speak the language, then they are not doing the philanthropy, or they are not understanding the thing. If they cannot write a proposal telling you in the 15 million ways in which they are going to change the lives of these 10 women carrying baskets on their head, then, you know, so it's replicated in even our own African foundations in the way that we do, because we're still stuck using the same policies, using the same reporting templates, using the same programmatic priorities, because at the end of the day, we have to report to those other people who are giving us the money to give to the others to save all these poor African lives, right? And so when I'm thinking about this question of knowledge and narratives and how we start telling our stories in decolonial ways, I think about, for example, the work that Drama Queens Ghana is doing through that Moon Girls comic, which I really encourage you to read, that looks at all the intersections and all the marginalizations and really shows the diversity that Essay you were mentioning about, you know, our communities are different. They're as different and as diverse as the continents, right? And they're all the things that we are learning, the things that we're unlearning, etc. I think about entities like Africa No Filter, who are trying to tell, you know, positive stories, but in that telling of positive stories, really not centering that wide gaze. So I think the question of knowledge and narratives is very strong when we're thinking about decolonizing philanthropy, because it's a core part of what we mean when we say that we want to decenter this wide gaze. We want to, you know, decenter our oppressors, for lack of a better word.
Thank you so much, Nadia and Gloria and Essay, for those reflections. While listening to Nadia's submission, I was just thinking about a section of a book that I read. It's titled Decolonization and Afrofeminism. I encourage everyone to read it. It's by Siva Tamale. And I'm just going to read a section out quickly. It says, coloniality reminds us on a daily basis that in this post-colonial period, we still live under colonial conditions. For colonization to succeed, it was important for the colonialists to capture the minds of the colonized. Not only did they restructure the knowledge systems of African people, but they also embarked on a mission to erase or to devalue their history, culture, expressions, and ways of being. Now, we've heard so many things that Nadia, Gloria, and Essay has also shared about how, you know, these legacies of colonialism has deprived us of imagination, of dreaming, of looking at new ways of doing things, of reflecting on what it means to, what does community means, what does community giving means. And when we talk about, for example, in Nigeria, I think about Funmilayo Ransome Kuti and how all the work she did with the Egba women, you know, she rallied around a lot of people, whether you were educated or not. Women were always coming together to, you know, think about solutions, to bring their issues, and people were always bringing up solutions for each other. I was reading something online also about a group in India, how they are women-only vigilantes and how they use sticks, you know, to beat up rapists or men that sexually violate women and girls in the community. How, you know, we practice all of these things. We don't call it big names, but they are there. It's like the manifestation of things that, you know, we just glamorize or just try to fit into the colonial systems or practices. But I know that, for example, Nadia, you work at AWDF, you have vast experience of what it looks like to reimagine, to bring up new initiatives. Essay, you mentioned briefly about Shift the Power. Gloria, you also work in a space where you are constantly reimagining philanthropy. You are constantly interrogating colonial legacies. So I'd just like us to come into that space of dreaming, of also sharing what are the new alternatives? Do we have any currently? And if you can share a bit on that.
Sure. I mean, I can start with, I think, with AWDF. So it is true that AWDF has existed for what, 23 years now. And I'll be very honest and say that we were stuck in the colonial practice of philanthropy for the better part of those 23 years. Our grantee partners will tell you that, we were in the proposal writings and the outcome harvesting and all of those things. We were in the practice of resourcing the recognized, women's rights organizations. When you were an activist, to be able to get resources from AWDF, you had to really fit the picture of polite African feminism and activism, right? And that is the reality. And so I think we came to the recognition of, if we wanted to continue to be relevant and to really live the feminist values that we are espousing, we had to change how we did things. We had to change how we even thought about doing things. And so we spent, I think, almost a year in what we called like a listening to movements exercise. And what we did is that, we surveyed past and current like grantee partners. We talked to African feminist researchers and facilitators. We set up an advisory committee of like these 8 feminist experts, and I can tell you they didn't let us rest. At every point they were like, whatever you're doing here is not it, and then we would have to correct course. And I think by the end of it, what we came up with was a new strategy. So we have this new 10-year strategic framework that was born out of this. And at the same time, internally as an organization, we did a lot of feminist grounding as well for our staff and our team members, because these things go hand in hand. You can't just have a new strategy and say it's feminist and then give it to people without having them actually go through the work of understanding what it means, what feminist philanthropy should look like what we're aiming for. And what we ended up coming up with at the end is this strategy that has no themes, right? Like really recognizing that women, girls, gender expansive people don't live single issue lives. Thank you, Audre Lorde. And so why should our responses fit in these boxes of economic justice, sexual and reproductive health, and rights, as if those things are occurring in while my eye is living one thing and then my nose is living the other one, and so we have this strategy that's really around strategic priorities, and the strategic priorities center resourcing movements and really thinking about resourcing broadly. So yes, there's money involved. Of course, we are a grant maker, so we make grants, but beyond that, how are we nurturing movements? How are we nurturing the agency and resilience of organizations? How are we engaging in movement building? How are we centering collective care and solidarity? Just these are some of the priorities. How are we talking to people who don't speak our language? How are we trying to use a little bit of AWDF's power to enter into conversations with these people, like these colonizers, right, who have just started this journey of what is it, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just have conversations in that space of, okay, like you don't speak our language, but this is actually what we mean, and this is what we need you to be able to do, and this is how we need you to start showing up so that we can also in turn show up with our movements, and even speaking to people who don't speak that language of gender justice, right, who are not necessarily in development. There are a lot of individuals who give charity, who give resources in communities, who are wealthy, but who don't necessarily have the level of exposure that people in development have to the diversity of the continent, to be able to go on the journey of unlearning all the harmful practices that we do have in our communities. And then another thing I think that we are piloting and starting to do is working differently before we used to work with registered organizations, you know, you had to have financial audited statements, you know, all the things. And now it's really about working with what we call movement entities. And so looking at working with artists, looking at working with individuals, you know, activists, just looking at that spectrum of diversity that we have on the continent in terms of people who are engaged in social transformation without them having to fit in that NGO box of, you know, I'm a development actor and I'm an NGO. I go to work at 9 a.m., go home at 5 p.m. and I've transformed my community. So we're really trying to depart from that. I think we're acknowledging that, you know, it's the beginning of the journey. There's just so much that we're going to learn and unlearn and pilot and try as we go along. And we're centering the accountability to our movements, but also trying as much as possible to influence our funders so that they understand that if you say that you are a funder and a philanthropic actor, you have to do the basics around trust-based grant making, around, you know, flexible funding, long-term funding, etc. If you really are in it for the social transformation, right? And not just to tick the box of saying, okay, I've given money to the poor Africans, they can now go and save themselves. So I think this is the journey that we've embarked on. It's a fresh one. And so, you know, we're learning as we go and hoping that it will deliver on the ambition, which is for now a 10-year ambition, but we know it's much longer term.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for sharing that important piece of work that AWDF is doing. I'm just thinking, you know, when I've heard this quote, I don't know if I've heard it or I was the one that coined it, but I'm going to give it to myself as the coiner. I always say it's that changes in small places births changes in big places. There is no way where all of this ambition of doing things differently will not have a ripple effect on movements, on grassroots organizers, on liberatory crusaders, on feminist activists. It will always have a ripple effect. And it's interesting to just see that intentionality coming even you donor-facing relationship, so grantees. And yeah, we'll always look out for AWDF and this new ambitious 10-year strategic
Keep
plan.
us accountable. Remind us
Yes,
when
we
we are
will.
starting to revert back to the things that we had said we were not going to do.
Yes, we will. And I'm sure everyone on the call will also take note of that. And if Gloria and Estelle also wants to share their bit.
Yeah.
I think
I think we keep doing this. Okay.
I know.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how, you know, all of these big quote unquote INGOs and partners from the global north, when they pack and leave, we bear the brunt of sustaining the work and keeping together the communities that have already been thinking and doing the work. And so what, for example, like AWDF has been doing for all these years is incredible. And it has really, I think, uplifted so much, but also just like facilitated a lot of change for African women and gender expansive persons. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging that whoever is doing work within the global south is really heavy lifting. So even as we think about like the ways in which we are not doing it perfectly or reinforcing some of those colonial legacies and structures, I think it's important for us to remember how also it's very important to have collectives and organizations that are within this context. And so the work that we do at Uhai Ishri, first of all, Uhai Ishri is just an audacious, against all odds, against all societal norms kind of funding initiative that has been operating for more than 13 years now. And it basically funds sexual and gender minorities and women that are considered bad women, for example, gender expansive persons and sex workers, but also really looking at Pan-African and indigenous-led activists, and so doing that work within the Africa that we live in, and the rise in fundamentalism, in extreme religion attacks, religious attacks. I think that it's audacious, it's bold, and it's a testament that if we dare as a people, if we dare find our own solutions, we can actually make this work. And we can sustain movements, we can sustain the work, the dreaming, the reimagination, if we are committed to this work. And so its existence also supports communities to not have to directly engage with the harmful and abusive and sometimes really violent frameworks and practices that are usually coming from the global north. So like being able to leverage, obviously, like the power to say, no, we cannot take back this to our communities, and this is what we think is possible, and this is how we think our communities are working. So for example, sustainable funding, flexible funding, funding and thematically, again, like just recognizing that as a people, I think this is, Nadia mentioned this around living, we don't live single issue lives. So recognizing that and funding ideas and dreams, not necessarily these quote unquote thematic areas. It has been very important for the communities, but also just being that accessible partner that, you know, you can call on phone. I usually interact with some of our grantees, just like we're having a conversation, being able to deconstruct that power that has existed for a very long time between a funder and a grantee, and thinking that funders or donors or, you know, partners sit in these ivory towers somewhere and they just move resources, and rightly so. Resources, I mean, funds or money are not the only resources that people need. Like, there needs to be that level of relationship building, that level of trust that is can only be grown if you're in constant community and contact with the people that you're working with. So UHA is not this funder that is based somewhere and then there's a community they are sending money to. We are within and embedded within the communities in which we work and serve, and also using approaches that are centering community voices and priorities, and using an approach of participatory grant making, which really was a realization that even as a funder that is based within the movements, within the context, we are sometimes not aware of the issues, because again, we can, as a Ugandan, I cannot represent the issues of all Ugandans, right? So just being cognizant of that fact and having you know, a committee of peer activists that are going to sit and review proposals that come in and are able to make decisions, again, based on the realities that they live in, which has been, I think it's quite very political, obviously, to move into that kind of fund grant making, although we see now so many people are doing it again as a political move, but I think it needs to be deeply analyzed and, like, you know, understood that just having a committee who are going to say yes and no to a proposal is not enough, is not participatory enough. So just going beyond just having that in a document somewhere and saying we are participatory grant maker, but just actually holding ourselves accountable to the committees and to the activists on the ground, and vice versa. And one last thing that I think I would want to mention is that, again, development or growth or community engagement is not only limited to money. And I think that this is something that we have also continuously to learn from other people like GFCF. I'm sure AC will have so much to speak around that, but understanding that there are already existing resources within the community. So even though we are coming in as a funder or as a partner that has some of the funds, it's not the only thing that is going to make the work work. And so we have, communities that have been organizing around legal representation, around just, just standing in for people, rescuing people, providing shelter for people that have been denied shelter from their families. Already those are resources that are existing. And what we also try to do is to just come in and not amplify, but just support what is already happening with funds, with continuous partnership building between ourselves, but also just opening up spaces for our grantees to be able to learn and find other ways that are, beyond highways or beyond their own ways, to just building that level of participation that is beyond just a funder and a grantee. I think that there's so many ways of doing this work, of reimagining, of dreaming, but at the core of it is decentering white supremacy and decentering the funder and beneficiary, giver and receiver kind of relationship, and just understanding that people within communities are doing this work and they know what they're doing, and we should trust that. And we should not come in with this hubris of, setting priorities that are currently trending or catchy or, whatever we call innovative. So at the core of it, we have to center the people that are doing this work and that are living the realities. And I would like to stop here for now. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you so much, Gloria. There's this thing I reflect on also when you talk, and just to say that, when there's a lot of buzz around participation, participatory and inclusion, which in reality we see more of tokenism and performation. Like, it is not participatory when you stop at, oh, this is what we are doing and you have to take it. Oh, we included one queer person in the room or one person with disability in the room to make the decision. That is performative and that is tokenistic, right? And if we do need to practice participatory grant making, we actually need to go all the way in and know what that means, and decentering oneself, decentering your own agenda, decentering, donor agenda is one way. And I'm glad that that's one of the things you are doing. Essay, I know you also want to say some big things about Shape the Power movement.
Yeah, sure. Just listening to Gloria, one of the things that struck me is, this idea, like, you just talked about participatory grant making. Philanthropy, traditional philanthropy is very risk adverse, right? So one of the questions I've always asked is like, what would it mean, or what would it take to get a market woman be the board chair of an actual institution and actually make the decisions? And we'll be terrified of that, right? Naturally, like, oh my God, no. Well, we'll mean inclusion, but not that kind of inclusion. It's just go just a little bit far, but we are afraid, and I think that fear comes from what Nadia mentioned in terms of the accountability piece. Right, we have to then at the end be accountable for how we spend our funds and who it goes to. So I think one push in that direction would be to really embrace this fear around philanthropy and to really have those marginalized groups, those voices, actually lead us and actually make the decisions. I think that is one step into this reimagined world that we are all striving for. And I also love the fact that after speaking for almost an hour, we're now all talking about our organizations. I had that little blurb there in the beginning, but I actually forgot to talk about the Global Fund. So the Global Fund for Community Foundations, I think we are one of the convening, we are a convening, networking, bridge building organization. And I think for us, one of our philosophies or thinking is that, we believe that long-term change towards this idea of a good society and the future we want really does require a collective action. And this is both of individuals and institutions located across the entire system. So you don't only have to be from the global South. It can also be from the global North. These are institutions, mostly though, that we work with that are usually on the fringes, at the edges of the centers of power. So often they will not get to come to webinars like this because they have their heads down, just focused on the work. But we work across all levels, so from grassroots, local to national and international organizations. You wanted me to say something about the shift of power movement. So, you know, it started really as a hashtag, and the hashtag was really an invitation to talk about power dynamics. And we wanted the hashtag to be provocative enough to get people to be curious and to ask, like, what do you mean? And this was at a conference in Joburg, the Global Fund for a conference in Joburg around community foundations and power and communities specifically. But the global movement now really recognizes that the entire system, has been mentioned in the past hour, is broken, and that the global movement is a radical call for a different way of working and doing development, respecting the rights of communities to really decide for themselves without imposing unjust policies and rules over them. And I think for us, the Global Fund, what does decolonization actually look like when we do grants? It's supporting organizations across the sector. I can just talk about maybe 2 or 3. One in Kenya called the Kilimani Project Foundation, really supporting them in their efforts to engage in rights claiming by advocating for planned development and protection of green spaces. That's one way it looks like. Another way in West Africa is supporting a women's fund, IPBF in Burkina Faso, to strengthen capacity needs of partners. This is the first fund for Francophone young feminists in West Africa. And so it's really believing in that dream and that vision and walking the walk with them, not necessarily having project-based. Maybe one thing I should say about the way that we fund and the grants that we give, these tend to not be specifically around projects. So this idea of project cycle funding is not something that we do. So if we do fund a partner, if we do fund an institution, it really is, grants really is a way to begin a relationship with them. And so many of our grantees are returning grantees, and we've been with them for almost a decade now, because we support that belief that, you know, it's not specifically a project. And I think it's sometimes hard for organizations who are interested or who want to receive funding from us, because they come with the typical, as Nadia mentioned, a typical sort of proposal. You have a project, in 12 months, you would have solved poverty. In 12 months, you would have ended malnutrition in women, in children, et cetera, et cetera. We don't fund that way. So it's really around, if money was not an issue, what would you do as an institution, as an organization? How would you bring people together? What does that look like? And we support that conversation and that inclusion. I know we have maybe 10 minutes left, but I was going to just give you just 4 sort of recommendations or ideas around what decolonizing could look like in practice. So very simply is around empowering communities. The second thing is around focusing on historically marginalized groups. So you really want to bring people who are at the edges into the center. It is about internal diversity and transparency, and really deciding for ourselves what success looks like. So, you know, one of the things that colonialism has done is that it's made us forget to dream. And so if we are able to now dream and actually think about that, then we can actually have our own definition of what success looks like, you know, so that it's not log frames and indicators and outcomes, which is such a soul-sucking experience when you have to report back to donors. And I think the last thing is that you have to trust the process without controlling it. And this is really the essence around power and letting go, and being comfortable with discomfort, being comfortable in abstractness. Because we are dreaming of a future that we can't quite actualize yet, we can't quite see, you have to really have hope at the center and believe that, you know, you get there, you will get there in the end. Sort of, you know, this idea of building your wings as you fly, you hope that you will get there, and it's not a crash. You don't crash and burn, and it's a horrible scene. But you know, this this idea of truly letting go and truly trusting the process and moving with and where the energy is really important, because only then can you really see those things that percolate up to the surface that matters. So I think I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Essie. And you end on the good notes by giving us some, really key recommendations that we can take home. And I do appreciate you. I appreciate Gloria and Nadia also. You have all steered this conversation in a way that really puts us in that reflective space. I don't know if there's anyone. I have about 5 minutes for anyone to share their reflections or question. Yes, Alimatu, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you for such a brilliant insight. For somebody who has worked in the space of international development as an activist and an advocate for women and girls' rights. Though I joined the program a bit late, but I've been following the conversation prior to the actual event itself. And it was something I really wanted to engage in. And thank you so much for bringing it to our attention. So my name is Alimatu Dimoni Kenny, and I am a campaigner on harmful traditional practices and violence against women and girls. And for over 30 years, this is something I'd love doing it, not only because I'm a survivor of these issues that I'm sort of campaigning on, but also that the need for particularly African, Black and ethnic minority women we're faced with. But over the time, what I encountered was that even though we are the lead voices or the advocates, let's just say, either grassroots or on the front line doing all the hard work, we were simply not trusted for any things like grants or funding or whatever. It seems as if in order for us to get funding, we'd have to go to others in order to get that funding. And for me, it really sent sort of a disappointing perspective, because at one point I thought we were all in the same sort of boat. We're going to one goal. We're trying to end violence against women and girls. But if funders and those that will sort of support our campaigns don't believe in us, would rather send somebody else to carry out the funding initiative or actually delivering the programs that we have fought hard for, it just sent a sort of a really bad taste in my mouth. And I just wanted to know if you have any perspective. Is this something that's very common? Because myself and others have now started having this conversation where we're actually saying, fund those that are working on the grassroots. You've got to trust African women. You've got to trust Black women. It seems as if nobody wants to trust us with their money. I mean, some of us are doing the work for 0 pence, so $0 or £0, and we are achieving huge impact. I mean, I have an organization called A Girl at a Time, and it's solely been funded by my sheer passion for wanting to end violence in Sierra Leone. And sadly, women like us who are actually fighting the status quo or trying to make changes are not seen, and funding goes to others who really are not making that push, to get things done. And I really would like to engage with yourselves. I know it's a 10-minute and we're sort of wrapping up, but if you could share some insight on how this has been for yourselves, and I'm here to learn.
Thank you so much, Alimatu. I see more hands. We do not have a lot of time. I don't know if Essie, Nadia, or Gloria would like to quickly respond to that.
Sure, oh, sorry, no, go ahead, Essie.
I was just going to say, I know that there are funds who who give directly to sort of institutions that you just mentioned. I can put it in the chat, but it may get lost. So one thing I can do is maybe immediately after this call, share some of those resources, some of those funders to Liberation Alliance, and then they can send it out to those who attended, because I can directly connect people to those sort of funding. So the institution that you mentioned, that you are championing, I can think of a couple of funders specifically in Sierra Leone who would be interested in supporting that. So maybe right afterwards, but I can share those resources to Toby and Lara.
Yeah, I would just like to say that we'll be sharing all of the resources that we've mentioned today, including the recording of this session. to everyone. And also my colleague Nana has dropped a link to subscribe to our newsletter. So you can subscribe so that you can get all of the updates also. If you like, we have about 2 more minutes. So and I do want to take these hands. But if Wahiga Muhena, if you're speaking, please make it very short and straight to the point. So I'll start with Wahiga. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. I'm sorry, I did not.
Hello, yes, you did. Yes, you did. Thank you for that. Great. I'm happy actually to hear this conversation, especially in regard to how it aligns also to how Africa generally changes the way it tackles poverty. And I like the speakers, they were so confident on what they were saying, because decolonizing philanthropy is also decolonizing just the language itself, honestly. We might not believe in the words or even understand the adjectives philanthropy, but when you talk about Harambee and community giving and all that, we really understand what that means. So I have the privilege of also serving with Global Giving, which is an organization that's an intermediary between funders and grantees. And so part of this conversation is actually ensuring that we, in my work within Africa, I also get to people who are doing the real work, because within the community-based organizations is where there is real need, there's real value to achieve and bring, and then also there's real wealth to create and grow and share around. So thank you so much for this. I wrote my links on LinkedIn, so we'll be happy to connect. Thank you.
Thank you. Munene, please, just quickly.
Hello, hi. I'm Munene Kamunde, and I would just like to, support what one of the ladies mentioned about, the traditional ways of Africa doing things. And I think her name was Essie. And as Africans, we should, look for indigenous ways of, of doing things in the African way, as we are promoting the African culture. Because currently, the founder of African Rangers initiative that entails, speaking about the mental challenges that rangers within the African conservatives go through. And one thing I have noticed is that as Africans, it's very difficult for us to be embraced by those, people who, are doing a very great job within the wildlife community. And because, as Africans, we understand more about how, the human wildlife conflict that goes on and how we can promote this. So it has been a very difficult, journey, for us Africans, to get inside, those circles by, by promoting what, we know through the African way. So as we are doing things, I think it's very good if we could internalize and come up in a very unique way. By unique, I mean, the African, indigenous ways on doing stuff. With those
Thank you so
few
much,
comments, thank you so much.
And I'm so glad that this conversation provided insights on thinking differently, even for you. Amina, you're the last person. So if you could share your submission in less than 30 seconds. Hi, Amina, are you there?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Thank you so much for everything. I've learned so much since I came here. And there's quickly something I wanted to share with every one of you. The more I listen to Gloria and Nadia, the more I realize all of these systems of oppression are linked together, whether it's capitalism, whether it's patriarchy, every single system of oppression is linked together. So I think additioning to what everyone has been saying since the beginning of this meeting is really to challenge all of those system of oppressions. since they are all linked together, once we challenge one of them, we challenge all of them. So I've learned so much here, and I wish I could go on and on, but I think we're done, and I don't have no more time, so I'm just gonna let it there. And
thank you
thank you
so
again.
much, Amina. And just to say that the conversation does not end here. We are active on social media, and since the beginning of the month, we've started a campaign and just, interrogating content and resources around philanthropy, and we would also engage with this resource and just to keep the conversation going. So you can connect with us online. And while you were talking, Amina, I remember one of the things my co-dreamer Omolara will always say anytime we're in that space of dreaming, that we must look beyond the symptoms and focus on the root causes, right? And it just re-echoes what you say and all the things that we've been saying since the beginning of this session, that we must, always look at the root causes of all of these systems of oppression instead of just focusing on the symptoms. And that is what we hope this discussion will open our minds to doing in our respective spaces and institutions. I would like to thank Nadia, Gloria, and Essay again for sharing this conversation. This has truly been a reflective, deep insights into decolonial feminist philanthropy. My colleagues Omolara and Nana have been so helpful also with logistics and technical issues. So I'm doing a shout out to them. Thank you, every one of you, for those that have joined since the beginning of the session, those that joined in the middle, and those that joined later. Thank you for contributing in the chat. It has been very engaging. Thank you for staying on, and I wish you all the best wherever you are, and have a good day. You can catch up with us online, and let's keep the conversation going. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Gloria.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Toby, for fabulous, for fabulous. Thank you to everyone who joined. We can't wait to see you.
Yes, thank you. Bye.